our reports, Hamas has accepted a draft agreement for a ceasefire in Gaza, with mediators in Qatar saying they were at the closest point yet to achieving an end to 15 months of war. The three-phase truce would begin with the release of 33 hostages over a 6-week period in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian women and children imprisoned by Israel. Israeli forces would withdraw from population centres and there would be a surge in humanitarian aid. However, Qatar's foreign ministry has warned against overexcitement until a deal is signed. Emerald Maxwell has more.
Following 15 months of war and a year of negotiations, key mediator Qatar said that Israel and Hamas were at the closest point yet to reaching a phased ceasefire and hostage release deal.
The drafts have been delivered to both parties. The obstacles to the main contentious issues between the two sides have been overcome, and discussions are now underway regarding the final details.
The Israeli Foreign Ministry confirmed that the final details were being ironed out to get the agreement over the line.
They are being discussed right now with the delegations from all parties in Qatar, and we are really hoping and hearing good news in the next few hours.
Also hoping for good news soon, Israeli protesters gathered outside Parliament. Some hostage families fear that the deal taking shape will see only some of the remaining hostages freed.
We hope that in the coming hours we will hear news that there is an agreement, and that this agreement includes the return of all 98 hostages without exception.
It's time for a deal that includes everybody. That is what we demand and what we expect from the Prime Minister. My son, he doesn't deserve to rot in Gaza.
The plan needs the final approval of the Israeli cabinet. A majority of ministers are expected to back it, but it has not found unanimity. Police Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir on Tuesday threatened to quit, a day after fellow hardline nationalist minister Bezalel Smotrich called the emerging truce catastrophic.
The deal that's being formed is a deal made for Hamas. I call on my friend, Minister Bezalel Smotrich, to join me in full cooperation against the deal being drafted. Together, we can go to the Prime Minister and inform him that if he goes ahead with the deal, we will resign from the government.
Ben-Gvir also said he and Smotrich had used their positions to block the deal for a year. Both ministers want to keep up Israel's military campaign. Even as intense diplomatic efforts continued over the last 24 hours, Israeli forces pounded targets across Gaza, killing dozens.
Meanwhile, over a dozen Palestinians were killed in Israeli airstrikes across Gaza on Tuesday. According to medics, a strike in Deir al-Balah killed at least 10 people and wounded several others, while a house in Rafah was bombed, leaving 5 people dead and 4 injured. Well, for more on the situation, Arwa Damon, founder of INARA, an NGO that provides medical and mental health care to children impacted by war or natural disasters, joins me now. Thank you very much for speaking to us on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
What are the most urgent needs on the grounds for civilians in Gaza? I mean, winter is setting in and we've heard reports of children dying in the cold. What is the top priority?
I mean, it's really hard to designate a top priority in Gaza, which has always been the challenge because everything is a priority. But right now, actually, the priority is fuel, because fuel is at a frighteningly low level with the health sector and also the sector that's responsible for desalination, water distribution, hygiene, sewage, you name it, reporting that their fuel stocks are at zero. And of course, without fuel, you also end up jeopardizing the lives of patients inside hospitals. So there's roughly 2,000 patients who are relying on life-saving machines or treatments that require machines, that require electricity, that will end up having their lives jeopardized. There's also a severe shortage in food, especially in flour. And this has been going on since, November, December, where I remember I was last in Gaza in December and children were being crushed to death at lines in bakeries. And then, of course, you have winter and the lack of what we call winterization kits, which is anything from, warm winter clothes to additional blankets to providing families with things like sandbags so that they can fortify their tents or extra plastic sheeting, which is leading to, as you mentioned there, at least 8 babies having frozen to death. And so this is the situation that has continued in Gaza that we repeatedly have been warning about for months and months and months right now. And all we see is the situation continuing to deteriorate.
And what is the difference in needs between the people in the north of the territory, where Israeli troops have been focusing their efforts for months, and for those in the south who've tried to find refuge?
So if we go to Gaza's extreme north, which is where the Israeli military has been launching its most intense operation since October, November, the Jabalia area, Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, there people have had no access to proper food, and very few humanitarian missions are actually being granted access by Israel to be able to go to these areas. You only have one functioning hospital after the Israeli forces went in and basically decimated the Kamal Adwan hospital and detained a significant number of its staff, including its director. And most recently, in the last 24 hours or so, yet 2 more missions were denied. And these missions were specifically going to the one remaining hospital to deliver essential things like food, water, and also medication, fuel for the hospital. This was denied, and there's absolutely nothing that we can do as humanitarian organizations to be able to actually access these particular areas. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is the Netzarim corridor, which basically splits Gaza in half. So to the north of that, you have Gaza City, and then these northern areas I was just talking about. And to the south of that, you have, central and southern Gaza. And what kind of makes this whole system rather absurd and illogical is that I was just speaking about a flour shortage. Now, this is happening mostly in southern and central Gaza, where a 25-kilogram bag of flour, if you were to somehow find it on the market, would cost you roughly $400, which is an absurd number if you think about it. That same bag of flour costs $1.50 in Gaza City, because Israel has been letting flour into the northern part, into Gaza City, for example. And when we as humanitarian organizations try to put in permission to be able to move items, for example, that are being let into Gaza City to the south or vice versa, those permissions are repeatedly being denied. So it's not just a case of, getting humanitarian assistance into Gaza. It's also about which access point is that assistance able to get in from? Are we able to safely pick it up? And then our inability to actually move aid within the Gaza Strip based on the needs of the population.
All right, well, at this stage, we only have a vague outline of a potential ceasefire deal. But if it is signed, it's supposed to allow for a surge in humanitarian aid. How would you even then allow for its safe passage into Gaza? I mean, especially after we've seen attacks on convoys by gunmen in the past.
Well, there's right now roughly 120,000 tons of aid that is waiting to be cleared by Israel and to be able to access Gaza from 3 different crossing points. So the aid is there. In terms of, the ceasefire deal and what it means for distribution inside, we would hope that this would allow for a certain greater level of security, because the main issue is that the looting and the criminal gangs that are targeting the aid trucks, and these are gangs that operate in areas that are fully under Israel's control. They're in what's designated as a red zone, so an active combat zone that's constantly being monitored by these drones. That would allow for a certain measure of security along those routes. Plus, it would give us freedom of movement. So we wouldn't end up having to just use the routes that Israel designates for us to be able to use. And then it's also a supply and demand issue. So if there is aid, and if there is a flood of goods onto the market, a flood of aid into Gaza, the financial gain that these criminal gangs are getting from looting and stealing the aid is also going to drop significantly. But it's really important to point out here that, a ceasefire that's just going to stop the bombs from falling is not going to be sufficient to save lives in Gaza. That will save the lives that are being lost by what's coming down on Gaza from the sky. But unless there is a very real effort to bolster aid and help facilitate the population's access to aid, people are going to continue to die. I have a case that my charity INARA is working on right now of a little girl who's in Gaza City and has what's called a protein C deficiency, or at least that's what doctors think that she has. They can't run the full scope of tests to definitively determine that because those tests don't exist in Gaza anymore. But she's at risk because of this deficiency of already losing one of her limbs. And she needs to be moved to the south and needs to be emergency evacuated out of Gaza immediately. So along with everything else, we also need a greater level of facilitation for all of these medical emergencies and other patients, including, a significant number of children who need to receive treatment outside of Gaza as well.
Right, and what about education? I mean, even if there is a ceasefire, they've been without education for months, these children. It's not like they would have many schools to go back to.
No, and what you do end up seeing is, it's kind of an impressive effort because, anyone with an education background, a lot of teachers are kind of setting up what we call these makeshift education tents. And, you see the kids sort of clustered underneath a tarp, just so desperate to learn. And, you have organizations like Save the Children and UNICEF that are trying to put together an education program. But here's the other challenge. The importation, getting Israel to clear things like notebooks and pencils and other things you would need to actually, run a makeshift education program, those items are being rejected. They're not considered life-saving. And so that's an extra added challenge that we all face, is what actually is going to end up being allowed into Gaza. It seems rather absurd that, notebooks and pencils and pens and other items continue to not be permitted to cross into the Gaza Strip. But that's the reality that, we as humanitarian organizations and Gazans are facing.
All right, Arwa Damon, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your insight into the situation in Gaza. The founder of INARA, Arwa Damon, there.